Hi, and welcome to the Assembly Lines podcast. I'm Chris Torrance. In today's episode, I want to talk some more about my Apple II emulator, and specifically, I have two features that I want to show. The first is support for DSK and .po disk images, and I'll show how I can convert those to WAS and then boot them in my emulator. And then I want to add support for a second disk drive to my emulator so we can do things like copy programs from one disk to another. And if everything goes successfully with adding the second drive, then I'll have a special treat for you at the end of the video. So let's get started. The first thing that I want to talk about is converting DSK disk images into WAS disk images. And the reason I want to do that is because my Apple II emulator really only understands the WAS file format. And this is because this is closest to what the Apple II actually expects for its bytes. It's expecting to get back data values and address values that are in the disk encoding. So this is the 4+4 or the 6+2 encoding. However, for the DSK or .pl file format, these are just the final bytes as they would end up in memory. So for example, a DSK image is just 35 tracks times 16 sectors times 256 data values per sector, and this gives the total of 140K of data. So the easiest way to actually read these images in, say for my emulator, is to actually convert them on the fly from DSK to WAS. Let's see now how I did that. I actually found a converter called DSK to WAS2 over on GitHub by someone named Mr. Stevo, and it was under the MIT license, and so I was able to convert this from C to TypeScript and actually embed it within my own emulator. So thanks a lot to Mr. Stevo for developing this. If we scroll down to the bottom of this function, you can see we're taking the initial disk data, so this is the 140K, and then we also have a flag saying, is this a .po or a .dsk? Right now, the only way I'm telling is with the file suffix. There's probably a better way to tell that, but I haven't encoded the smarts for that. What we do in the code is just write out all of the header information. So here's all the WAS2 headers. And then we just start filling in all of the tracks. And when we do that, we need to encode the data properly. If we jump down to this serialize track function here, then this is just taking all of the data from one track. So this is 16 times 256 bytes. And we're just writing out first the gap fields, and so this is the sync bytes. So these would be the 10-bit FFs that are in the disk2 format. And then we're going to write out the address header. So we write out the D5AA96 prolog. We convert the address data into the 4 and 4 encoding. We then write the gap between the address field and the data field, write out the prolog for the data field, write the data field itself, and these are encoded in the 6 and 2-bit encoding, and then we finally write out the epilogue. Let's now see this in action. In my emulator, if I go ahead and pick a DSK image, say for example the game Chivalry, you can see that it reads it in and it's immediately converted it to a WAS. So we can go ahead and just boot this up now. Okay, and you can see that it booted properly, and we'll see here's the game itself. So we can go ahead if we wanted to and play it, and everything seems to be working. Now the fun thing is because I've converted it to a WAS file, I can go ahead and just download it. So if I just click on the disk drive, it's now downloaded that WAS to my desktop. If I go over to Applesauce, I can load that WAS up and take a look at it. And it just looks like a normal WAS file. Here's all the address and data fields, just like that. And so I've successfully converted it from a DSK to a WAS. So now I can go ahead and load any sort of DSK or PO files in my emulator as well as WAS files. The next thing we want to do is add support for a second disk drive to our emulator. We've gotten along so far with just one disk drive, but for many games or for copying disks, it's much more convenient to have two floppy disks. Let's see now what it's going to take to add a second disk drive. I'll switch over to my TypeScript code, and I'm inside my disk drive function here. Now, I've already started on this a little bit. What I did is I took my drive data and I put it into a function where it returns a blank or empty disk drive, and I've actually declared a new data type over in my custom.d.ts file, and this is all of the data you need for a single disk drive. So for example, the name of the disk that's inserted, here's all the disk data, where you are on the disk, so this is the half track and the previous half track, where you are within a track, so that's the track location, as well as other things like whether the disk has had any changes applied to it. Now over in my disk drive code, we need to actually add a new one. So let's go ahead and do that. Here's my drive data, which is just an array right now of one element. So I'll go ahead and I'll just add a second disk drive like that. Now that's not going to do anything except for just add support for the data. We actually need to add it to the user interface. So let's scroll down to the bottom now. And here's where I have my image for the disk as well as my file handler when I click on it to either load or save the disk image. So let's go ahead and we'll just copy these two HTML fields here, or React fields, and I'll just create a brand new one. So for the second one, I want to change all the references to drive data 0 to drive data 1. Now the next thing we need to do is actually change the image. If I go ahead and save this, we can see that sure enough we have a second disk drive. However, if I click on that, you can see that both drives closed, and if I click on open, then both of them open back up again. So this isn't quite right, and that's because we're just sharing the image between the two. So let's go back over here. Where do I define? Okay, here's my image. So I'm going to copy my disk drive image, and we'll change this to drive number 2, which is actually element 1 in my array. And we'll use that image now for the second disk drive. And there's one more thing I need to do that I'm forgetting here. Yeah, so we're gonna change all of these handle file input, the hidden ones, to number 2, and we'll change that, and handle disk click 2. Okay, and so this will actually read the disk. And now over in my read disk code, I have a new field called disk drive, and this will come in as either a 0 or a 1, and then it'll index the appropriate element in my disk drive array. Oops, and I can see I missed one here. So that's that. Now that we have a placeholder for where to put the second disk drive's data, we need to actually make use of the disk drive and make sure that the emulator actually knows about it. So let's scroll back up to the top of our disk drive file here, and what I've done is added a global variable called current drive, and this will be either 0 or 1 for drive number 1 or drive number 2. And I need to make use of this everywhere I'm going to access the drive. So for example, in the soft switches and all of my functions. Let's scroll down now. I've already done a little bit of work on this. And if we look for current drive, here you can see I'm in my move head function. So this is moving the disk drive head from one track to the next, say from the inner track all the way to the outer track. And all I'm doing now is I'm just indexing my drive state with whatever my current drive is. Now we still don't have a way to actually change that current drive, and we'll tackle that next. So let's scroll down to our handle drive soft switches. And this is where we want to actually make use of the soft switch to switch from drive 1 to drive 2. If we go over to our soft switches file, you can see that we have all of the drive switches down here at the bottom. And the one we're now interested in is this drive select, which is at C08A and C08B plus whatever your slot offset is. That's what we now want to handle in our handle drive soft switches. So I'm trying to put these in numerical order more or less. So let's just add a new if statement. If address equal switches dot drive drv select is what we want. Dot off address. And let's see if we can actually just handle them both in the same if statement, since they're going to be essentially doing the same thing. And let's go to our current drive is now going to be equal to, if address is equal to the off, it'll be 0, otherwise it'll be equal to 1. Let's see, so off switches to drive 0, on, oops, this needs to be on. And then we want to return a result. Let's jump over to virtual 2 and okay, here we are in virtual 2. C0E9 turns on the drive. C0EB should turn on drive 2. Okay, and you can see when I did that the motor kept running, but it just turned on disk 2 instead. And let's switch back to drive number 1 again. Yeah, and now it just switched back. I don't know if you can tell from the little light, but the motor keeps spinning and it just switches which drive is actually active. And if we want to turn it off, that'd be C0E8. Okay, and it turned off after 1 second. I think what I'm missing in my emulator is if I need to do something if the motor's running, because I got to get the other drive to start spinning. So if drive state of the other one, so let's see, 1 minus current drive, so that'll give me the opposite. Dot motor is running. Okay, then I want to turn it off. So equals false. And I want to turn on the current drive. So motor is running is true. So let's try this now. Go over to my emulator. You can see that it erased it because it had to reload the code. And let me just boot. Okay. Call -151. And let's see. I'll turn on the motor, C0E9. Okay, that turned on drive 1. C0EB should turn on, should switch from drive 1 to drive 2, which it does. C0EA switches back. And C0E8, yep, turns it off after 1 second. All right, let's try something more complicated with 2 disk drives. Let's actually try and copy a disk. So I'm going to put in my copy programs, and we'll just boot that. Okay, and we'll select Disk Muncher. All right, and let's put a blank disk in number 2, and we'll just copy, how about just copy this program onto itself? So return begins copy, okay. Speaking. All right, let's go ahead and boot that now. So I'm going to eject this one, and this one should be modified. So if I click on it, yep, it downloaded it. And let's go ahead and load blank.waz, the one that is on the desktop. And let's go ahead and boot. Okay, so that worked. So it looks like my 2 disks are working now. I wonder, so I haven't covered this yet in any of my videos, but I've upgraded this emulator from an Apple II Plus to a 2E. So I've added support for auxiliary memory as well as 80 columns and all of the memory banks. And so we should be able to run programs that require an Apple IIe. And because I just added support for a second disk drive, I'm tempted to try and run Noxarchaist. Now, I don't have double high-res graphics working, so I won't be able to do the splash screen, and I also don't have Mockingboard support. But just for fun, let's try it. I will pick the Noxarchaist boot disk to put into the first drive, and I know that it wants the overworld disk in drive 2. So I'll put that in, and let's go ahead and boot. Okay, so that's promising. Okay, there's the spinny thing, that's good. I'm just gonna hit the space bar because I know we don't wanna actually display the splash screen. So hopefully this will just bypass it. Okay, there it goes. Okay, you can see it's accessing disk 2 there, so it's verifying that you have the overworld disk in there. Wow. All right. That actually started up. I'm pretty excited about that. Let's see if we can actually start a new game here. Okay, I'm going to actually speed up the emulator until we get into it. Insert the main disk in drive 1. Okay, so we're going to eject the boot disk. Where's the keep? All right. And here we are on the ruins of the ship. All right, that seems like it is all working. So we've added a second disk drive, and we've clearly made some progress on the emulator since we can now actually run Noxarchaist. I hope you enjoyed this special episode of the Assembly Lines podcast. I made a lot of progress on my Apple II emulator. I was so excited that I was able to boot up Noxarchaist and have it actually get into the game. So both floppy drives work, and it seems like my auxiliary memory and everything else works like that. In a future episode, I'll talk about how I added support for the Apple IIe, including all of the soft switches for switching to auxiliary memory. If you're not currently a Patreon subscriber, I'll have a link in the show notes. And for those of you who are subscribers, I really appreciate your support. Speaking of subscribers, if you're not currently a YouTube subscriber, please hit the subscribe button down below. And once again, thanks for watching.